que é a vida. É o princípio da morte. O que é a morte? É o fim da vida. O que é a existência? É a continuidade do sangue. O que é o sangue? É a razão da existência.
Brazil's 1964 horror movie, At Midnight, I'll Take Your Soul, is an exploration of the truly reprehensible rebel against gods, men, and devils, Coffin Joe. Called Zé do Caixão in Brazil, which is short for Jose, who has coffins, or Joe, is a violent, lecherous, immoral, maybe atheist nutbag who wants to obtain immortality by getting rid of his girlfriend, killing his best friend, and impregnating his best friend's lover. On his way to this goal of becoming immortal, Joe commits all sorts of debauchery, brutality, and not a single thing to make you, the audience, like him. Yet somehow, you might just end up doing that. In this film, we are introduced first to Joe's ranting, raving philosophy on immortality, on man's ability to outshine and outlast both gods and devils. Joe's sole goal on Earth is continuing his bloodline via siring a child. We see his grim occupation as a gravedigger, because only the dead could really put up with his attitude and ways. Or will they? The most profound thing anyone can say about Brazil's own devil Coffin Joe is that he doesn't look like a movie serial killer. This is what I heard after I had just finished watching 1964's At Midnight, I'll Take Your Soul. The person I was watching the movie with said, Z doesn't look like a movie serial killer. I said back, oh, he looks pretty wild to me. She explained that wasn't what she meant. Further, she said, in most other films, the maniac is charming, erudite, well-read, and witty. The typical psycho is someone you would like if you happened to walk past them on the street, or shared a plate of fava beans with. They would make you like them by being charming. Even after this psycho has killed someone, an innocent person, watching a movie about him, you might feel for him. You might say, oh, it's a product of our society. They're just misunderstood. Heck, some chicks might even write to these people in jail, which has been known to happen, and send pretty revealing photos, too. Most films can't make us have an investment in the serial killer character unless they wheel back on their monstrous ways, just a bit. The serial killer has to have something that makes us have sympathy for the killer. Yet Joe, the villain? Joe's ugly. He's creepy, he's wrathful, he's demanding, he's disgusting. He is all the world of disgust. But you keep watching him. There's something extremely compelling in a horror movie that is the triumph of a villain. It shows him winning. There's no moralized story of a hero stopping him. It does this without moralizing things, without lying about who Joe is. And it becomes a more realistic movie, despite being so out there, so on the edge, so on the precipice of what's acceptable in society, and so extreme. It seems more realistic because in reality, not every serial killer is a charming Ted Bundy. And I think that's the lesson that we're getting here with Joe. So, with that statement about Joe's appearance, my friend changed my entire mind on the first Coffin Joe movie. Prior to her comment, I felt Joe was just an extremist, a shock artist, someone looking to commit evil just because choosing violence is a relatively easy thing to do. I did not think Coffin Joe was much else than shock. However, even though Coffin Joe is an unapologetic madman, you have to look at more than just the acts on a surface level to understand him as a character. It is Coffin Joe's extremism and zealous, unflinching rebellion against conventional society that must be understood and respected with that understanding. Joe is a character that's not just against the innocent characters in the movie, but a character against all expectations of a villain in popular cinema back then and even today. Joe's disdain for whatever other normal people are doing puts him at odds with everyone around him. If there's a religious holiday where it's a sin to eat meat, Joe's going to eat meat. If someone's playing a hand of poker while drinking, and they get a little fresh with Joe, Joe's going to stab a broken wine bottle into their actual hand. If you're investigating a crime where you see connections that others don't, connections that might tie Joe to a series of grisly murders, well, Joe's going to gouge your eyes out. Even if you're the actual devil, you don't get a pass. Joe's going to spit straight into hell and into the devil's face. As my friend explained further who Joe was in Brazil's history, I started to change my mind on him. Joe is sort of like a modern fairy tale character, an extreme icon that imparts a lesson a villain like, say, America's fallen Darth Vader or Russia's immortal Koschei may impart. Joe is as bad can be. He gets away with his crimes, for the most part. But people watching his movies accept that. And though they may fear him, and they do fear Joe, they also like him. And if I'm right here, and I think I am, because my Brazilian friend proofread my essay and they think it's on the mark, I can see why people like Coffin Joe. There's sort of an interesting dynamic here. Joe doesn't have any single moral struggle or confliction about what he's doing in this movie. It takes an incredibly powerful situation to make him even stop for a moment and think, hey, maybe I am the bad guy here. It's surprising Coffin Joe isn't on Mount Rushmore, honestly, given he's like the ultimate narcissist who stops at nothing to get what he wants. Anyway, that's something I think people can identify with. We all have those moments where we think, good Lord, I'd love to just smother you with a plastic bag, Karen. I'd love to get what I, as a regular person with not much power in life, want for once. Even if somebody, somewhere, has to get hurt to get there. I know it's a horrible thing to think, but you do think it. Everyone does. Everyone has that animalistic impulse, the dark impulse that we don't like to acknowledge. The one that is best friends to us in those lonely moments where, in our hellscape of a life, we wish we had even just a small amount of power to do things like hang up on somebody being rude to us at our jobs, to do things without fear of repercussions like being fired from those jobs. In those times, we might think, what would Coffin Joe do? But we don't do what Coffin Joe does. We have to maintain and be a better person. But that doesn't mean that there isn't something in us that's watching these movies anyway, watches us in those situations, and is waiting and is taking notes. Coffin Joe is an acknowledgement of both the darker desires of man and an example of what can happen to you if you follow through on those impulses. But even further, it's a sort of celebration of being true to yourself, true to your desires, even after the consequences of following through with actions like Coffin Joe's arrive. Not necessarily saying you're murdering somebody, but you may do something that people would frown on for certain reasons that have always just been there and you don't really understand why. Taking a candy bar or something really bad like that, right? Anyway, you may find yourself figuratively at hell's door. We are all fighting hard battles. And even if some of us can't brush off what society regards us as, even if we can live with others seeing us poorly, and we say things like, oh, I don't care what other people think about me, I'm just living my life. We all still have to hope that we have satisfaction with how we live, especially at night when we're lying in our beds with just our thoughts to occupy us. Or if we don't do that, we welcome a personal hell into our lives. And Joe, well, he's standing in the dark at the foot of the bed, understanding, watching us, and waiting. Even in real life, Joe's actor, writer, and director, Jose Mojica Marins, was a controversial figure. He was driven. He was weird. I mean, obviously he was weird. He was apparently not too terribly far off from Coffin Joe, the character, in terms of his ambition and his behavior. He took bold moves to accomplish what he wanted in life. Stories drift on the internet, unverified, that Marins would use real insects, for instance, on his cast to test their courage. And this can plainly be seen in this film that I'm reviewing here when a real tarantula crawls across an actress. Her reaction is probably real. In fact, Marin's real nails on his hand were kept nastily long so he could readily become Joe, the character, Coffin Joe, at any moment. It should be said that there are many more stories about Joe that cast him and Marins, the real person, in a negative light. But there's also stories that aren't as popular and aren't on the internet that my friend, who lives in Brazil and knows about Coffin Joe and has relations to people that were related to Coffin Joe knows. And they're nicer stories. They're stories about Jose being a man who handed out candy to the children in the neighborhood who visited the creepy home. He was always willing to do something to be a character for children, to give them some joy in their lives, and that's a really awesome thing. Sometimes actors aren't like that. Sometimes they're, I don't want anything to do with the character. I just played it to get money, and that wasn't Jose. He was the real deal. So all of this only adds to Coffin Joe's mystique. And I think we have to remember that all villains cast two shadows. The truth of the actor is one, and the myths and legends that surround the character is the other one, the bigger one. Much has been said on the internet and in books about Coffin Joe and Marin's and his cinematic accomplishments, but I was actually, again, able to have a unique take on Coffin Joe from my friend, who, again, is Brazilian. For her, she experienced Joe as someone who was on television reruns in the 1990s. Joe wasn't like an art house film figure, like he may be kind of for Americans who are just finding out about him, and it's really hard to find him unless you're talking to a film nut. He wasn't just a crazed filmmaker or a jerk or the target of maybe government censorship in Brazil. Joe and Jose, they were someone children watched in the afternoon and were terrified of that night. Coffin Joe has accessed some base fear of the human mind, has become eternal, has become the boogeyman for a lot of kids out there. Apparently my summary of him is truer than I know because Joe's character was actually inspired by a vision seen in Jose's nightmares. Before I knew this, as I watched At Midnight I'll Take Your Soul, I had to admit that the madman who wrote, directed, and played Joe himself, after the main actor had quit and refused to be Coffin Joe, when Marins took over the role as actor for Coffin Joe 2, he had actually done quite a good job at creating a world of dark shadows, repulsive acts, unique effects, and awesome filmed gore. All done on a very small budget. Joe does horrible things in this movie. He rapes women, he gorely mangles a man's hand of a broken bottle for talking to him in a way that Joe perceived as incorrect, stabs out a man's eyes, blinding him. All of this is shown with grisly power that gives the acts a point. It isn't needless violence in the sum of the story. Aside from At Midnight I'll Take Your Soul's competency, acts in movies like these were rarely seen in horror at this time. This Brazilian barbarian went, and he went there in style. Horror in the 60s was just starting to creep into becoming visually violent again, with 1960s Psycho at the forefront of that movement, Herschel Gordon Lewis's unknown gory weirdness going on in the 1960s basement, and 1968's Night of the Living Dead ending the idea of horror as just a fun and fanciful kids' fair. We of the wider world are only now becoming aware that somewhere in cinema's darkening dusk, Coffin Joe was burying bodies in the cemeteries of Brazil, casting a hateful look at the world with his bloodshot eyes, cursing God and the devil while doing it. If we aren't too repulsed by the acts in these movies, we may learn something here. If you're going to be a bastard, be the bastard. There's no sympathy for this devil or for you, but there is respect for Coffin Joe, a magnificent monster. Remember, life sucks, but your movies don't have to.
Que é a existência.